All right, good day, good morning, good evening, good night to you, wherever and whenever you're watching me. This is your brother and friend Maurice, and what are we going to talk about this time around? Well, we're going to be deep diving into chapter 1 of the book of Revelation. We're going to talk about how Christ was revealed in the catastrophic events which that vision predicted to happen in John's time. We're going to look at how the vision was one prophecy which could not be divided up. It all had to come to pass in John's time. And we're going to look at the number 7 as the 7 churches that symbolize their being perfected in Jesus Christ. You're watching the New Cosmos videocast.
This is the New Cosmos videocast. You've never heard it like this anywhere. Welcome.
And welcome. So today we begin a new series of videos on chapter 1 of the book of Revelation, also called the Revelation of Jesus Christ. And you may be saying, what's so interesting about Revelation chapter 1? Aren't they more intriguing chapters like chapter 13, the mark of the beast, the number of his name, or maybe chapter 4 and 5 with the 7 seals, or maybe the lake of fire, Revelation chapter 20. Yes, those may be interesting, yes, but you would be amazed how much information is in Revelation chapter 1, and also how much that information can benefit you today. Now, Revelation chapter 1, or chapter 1 of the book of Revelation, is like the introduction, it's like the prologue, it's like the preface to the vision. And so there's a lot of important information in that chapter which is necessary for you, for anyone who is going to read the vision, so that they can understand it in its proper context. So as usual, when we're doing multi-video studies, this is a multi-video study, there would be 3 points per video. This first video I will call Jesus Christ Revealed in a Short Time. Now remember, if you appreciate this content and you think that it's important, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And support the channel by purchasing one or both of my books, and also from the merchandise store, preterisgear.com. The links are in the description of this video. And with that said, we will look at point number 1 when I come back. Alright, so we are back and we're going to begin with our point number 1. Our series is chapter 1 of the Revelation of Jesus Christ, and this is part 1. This is the first video. And remember, this first video is entitled Jesus Christ Revealed in a Short Time. Our text for point number 1, well, point number 1 says Christ was to be revealed in John's time. Christ was to be revealed in John's time. And our points for our scriptures for this point are Revelation 1 verses 1 to 3, Ezekiel 6 verses 10 to 14, John 13 verse 19, Matthew 24 verses 3, 30, and 33 to 34, John chapter 21 verses 22 to 24, Matthew 16 verses 27 to 28. Those are a lot of that's a lot of information. So we want to go straight to our Bible and look at Revelation chapter 1 verses 1 to 3. It says there, "This is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon come to pass. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who testifies to everything he saw. This is the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and obey what is written in it, because the time is near. So we have here, those of you who have followed my studies, you would know these 3 verses are what I always point folks to before you read any other chapter in the book of Revelation. Make sure you read at least these 3 verses here, because these 3 verses provide the context, the audience relevance to whom this vision was given, and for why and for what purpose. Okay, we notice here that the revelation of Jesus Christ, it's a revelation of Jesus Christ, something about Christ that was to be revealed, and it was given to show his servants, whether it's the servants of God or the servants of Jesus Christ, what must soon come to pass. All right, he made it known by sending his angel or his messenger to his servant John. So we notice the servants here in the first case would be the apostles, right? So this vision of the revelation of Jesus Christ was given firstly to the apostles. And so it had to have relevance to the apostles. It had to be relevant to their time. And so the things, what must shortly or soon come to pass, would be coming to pass soon in their time. All right? And so the time had come for Christ to be revealed. So which means there were certain things, certain hidden aspects of Christ which would be revealed, and it would be a complete revelation of Christ. So all that was needed to be known about Christ was about to be revealed to his apostles and those of the apostolic ministry, and by extension the remnant people at that time. And this revelation of Christ would be seen in the catastrophic events which were predicted in the vision. All right? So Revelation chapter 1 is not actually the vision. It's saying certain things, it's giving certain information before you get to the vision, right? But Revelation 1, 2, and 3 is like the prologue. It's like giving you to whom this thing was sent, to why and when. Okay? So now we have this information telling us that these things would happen in the which were listed or which were predicted in the vision. They were going to happen soon. They were soon to come to pass. And as usual, I always make the point that soon is not soon from when you read it. When you in the 21st century read in the vision, the soon doesn't apply to you. The soon was for John and the people living in his time. These things would come to pass soon from John's perspective or from John's point in time. So as these events occurred, they would be seen to manifest Christ's presence. All right? Ezekiel chapter 6, for example, is a good example of this. All right? Ezekiel chapter 6, we have Ezekiel, the prophet to Israel. And if we jump down to verse 10, we have here where the Lord, through his prophet Ezekiel, was predicting a day of judgment, a time of judgment to come upon Israel, because, as usual, Israel was in apostasy. They were breaking they were transgressing their covenant. They were not keeping their covenant obligations. So the Lord would oftentimes allow them to be defeated. They would allow them to be, and in this case, he was talking about where Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would come bringing destruction. He said, this is what the Lord says, clap your hands, stomp your feet, and cry out, alas, because of all the wicked abominations of the house of Israel, who will fall by the sword and famine and plague. He who is afar off will die by the plague. He who is near will fall by the sword, and he who remains will die by famine. So I will vent my fury upon them. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Now this is, I want us to take note of this. You see, in the famine, in the plague, in the sword, that means an army invading and destroying using the weapon of the sword. In those calamities which the Lord would allow to come upon Israel, would be, then you will know that I am the Lord, right? You could also word it to say, then you will see that I am the Lord. Okay? Through these judgments which were coming on Israel. When I say you, I mean Israel, right? Then Israel would see that I am the Lord. When their slain lie among their idols around their altars, on every high hill, on all the mountain tops, on the every green tree and leafy oak, the places where they offered fragrant incense to all their idols, I will stretch out my hand against them, and wherever they live, I will make the land a desolate waste, from the wilderness of Diblah. Then they will know, here's that phrase again, then they will know, or then they will see that I am the Lord. All right. Now look at how Jesus said something very similar to that in John chapter 13, verse 19. Okay, John chapter 13, verse 19, and we're going to read this in the Faithful Version translation. It says here, look what Jesus said to his disciples. I am telling you at this time, before it happens, so that when it does happen, you may believe that I am. Now notice, in the Old Testament we just read there, God would bring in all of these judgments upon Israel because of their apostasy. And he says, when these things happen, you will know that I am the Lord. Okay? Now look at Jesus says, I'm telling you about these things. I'm making these predictions so that when they happen, you may believe, or you may see, or you may know that I am. So notice, the things that Jesus predicted, when they happened, when they occurred, it would be as evidence that he is, or he's using the I am, which is the name of his Father, which is the claim to being divine, right? So he's saying, you may believe that I am. Right? So the fulfilled prophecy was Jesus's claim to divinity, right? And that was what was being revealed in the revelation. Jesus's divine nature, his divine prerogatives, right? That was how he was being proved, or it was being proved that he was indeed the Son of the living God, seated on the right hand of the Father, or the right hand of power, reigning in the heavens, which is all in the realm of the unseen, right? So how would his presence be detected? How would his presence be felt or seen or understood or perceived? It would be through these acts of judgment, which he, as the executor of God's wrath, was going to bring upon Israel for their transgressions of that covenant which they had been under. So these judgments in the ancient times were called comings of the Lord, right? When the Bible talks about the coming of the Lord, it's not unique to Christ. It was not unique to the Son of God. There were comings of the Lord in the ancient scriptures as well. And these were where the Lord manifested his presence. Now, not his form. His presence was manifested, not his form. Okay? So there was not a form which men could see and said, look, that is the Lord. But his presence was manifested within the calamity, within the judgment, whether to punish or to save. And in those two aspects, punishing or saving, his presence was perceived. In other words, then men knew that this was of the Lord. Then men knew this was the Lord had come and had judged or had saved. Okay? So similarly with Christ, when the judgments began to pour out on Jerusalem and Judea, then men perceived that this was of Christ because he had predicted it. And he says, when it happens, you would believe that I am. All right. So that's the revealing of Christ. It's the revealing of who he really was or really is, depending on your perspective. All right. So throughout the book of Revelation, Christ is seen or perceived having several titles. Now, 3 of those titles are in verse 5. Okay, maybe we can look at them briefly. Revelation 1 verse 5. Revelation 1 verse 5, it says there, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, so that's one title. The firstborn from the dead, that's another title. The ruler of the kings of the earth, that's another title. So these titles you would see within the vision, the things which were happening in the vision of the revelation. Christ would be depicted as the faithful witness. You would see him being depicted as the firstborn from the dead. You will see him being depicted as the ruler, or the one who has authority over the kings of the earth, or greater authority than the kings of the earth, right? Meaning he has the highest authority. He's the highest authority over all powers of the earth, right? In the unfolding of the events which the revelation predicted, which were, as verse 1 and 3 say, to come to pass in the time of John and those living in John's time, Christ was to be revealed as functioning in these roles or titles or offices on behalf of heaven and on behalf of humanity. So the visible catastrophes, the visible calamities, the visible judgments, the visible upheavals, which were about to be unleashed upon the land of Judea, were to be but signs, visible signs, of the invisible power and the divine nature of Christ, who was dwelling in the invisible realm. So in other words, these things, these visible events, were signs of the invisible Christ. You know, in Romans chapter 1, it talks about the creation, the visible creation is evidence of an invisible God. All right. So when you see and you analyze and you examine creation and its complexity, yet its simplicity, you have no other choice but to realize and conclude this was designed by a superior intelligence, which we call God, right? So similarly, in these visible upheavals which were to come on the land of Judea in John's time, those were to be visible evidence of an invisible God who was judging Israel for its covenant transgressions. Look at Matthew chapter 24. We're going to go verse 3, 30, 33, and to 34, okay? Matthew chapter 24. All right, Matthew 24. Look what it says there, verse 3. All right. Let's go back to our Berean Study Bible. It says, while Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will these things, these things would be, they were referring to the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem. All right? So they're asking, when would the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem happen? And what will be, look now, the sign of your coming? And remember I said this word coming here is presence. Okay? Let me put it in the lexicon for you. Notice it's the word parousia. Okay? A being near. Okay? An aspect, a presence. Okay? So what would be the sign of your presence? Okay? Now let's ask the question, why would it be necessary for them to see a sign of Christ's presence instead of seeing his very presence? It is obvious that they understood that his presence would not be visible. Okay? His presence would not be visible. Therefore, they would need to see a sign, evidence of his presence, visible as evidence of his invisible presence. So understand, Christ parousia, which most Bibles put it as coming, but when you go to the Greek, that word there is parousia. Christ's presence was never to be a form, a visible form, whether of a physical body or some supernatural visible body. It was always to be an invisible presence, so that there needed to be a sign or signs of that presence, right? Let's move on to verse 30. Verse 30 says, if we look at our modern literal Bible, it says there, and then will appear the sign, okay, visible evidence of the Son of Man in heaven. All right, now notice the difference. You have the Son of Man in heaven, the Son of Man who is in heaven, right? Which means the Son of Man who is in the realm of the invisible. That's what heaven is, the invisible realm. So the Son of Man in the invisible realm, there needs to be a sign, a visible sign, a visible evidence that would let the people in John's time know that the Son of Man is in heaven. In other words, he is in his divine role now. He has taken the glory of his Father. He is reigning on his Father's throne. All of these divine prerogatives he is now exercising, and there would be a sign to let them know that. Okay? It's not that you look up in the sky and you see some cross in the sky or something like that. No. The sign would be events, or an event which would happen on the earth in the time of the disciples, which would be evidence that the Son of Man indeed is in heaven, right? That's what the sign of the Son of Man was. And so we go down to verse 33 now. It says, even so you also, meaning you, who is the you there? It's the disciples. That's who we were speaking to. So he says, you disciples also, when you disciples see all these things mean all the signs of him being the judge in heaven, executing the wrath of God, you know that it is near, even at the doors. What it is the end of the age. Okay, that's what they asked in verse 3 also. Okay, even at the doors. Okay, so verse 34 says, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Good? This generation will not pass away. What generation was that? The generation to whom he was speaking. Again, so all these things were to happen in the time of the disciples, in that generation of Israel. You can't get away from it. It is there over and over and over again, right? So those events must have shortly come to pass, as Christ predicted. And when they came to pass, they were so that when the folks saw them, they would believe that Christ was I am. Okay? And they had to come to pass in John's earthly lifespan. That his lifespan, his earthly lifespan, was the time frame which Jesus himself had set for the accomplishing of his return. Look at how he put it in John chapter 21. John chapter 21. All right, let's jump down there. Book of John, chapter 21. And verse 22. Look at what Christ said down there. Jesus answered, if I want him, and the him here is John, okay? If I want John to what? Remain until I return. What is that to you? Okay? Jesus is saying, I want John to remain till I return. So John was one of those who would remain until Christ's return. And you remember Christ made that promise also in Matthew 16. Matthew 16 verse 27, right? These are some of the texts that many of you already know who've been following me, so you probably would know this already. But when Christ was speaking to his disciples, and as well there were other folks who were standing there listening to him, he said to them, for the Son of Man will come in his Father's glory. Notice, he will come in his Father's glory, which means he will come in his Father's divine nature. And his Father is spirit. His Father is invisible. Right? So his coming would be in the realm of the spirit. It would be invisible. So that's why there would need to be a sign of his coming. And that is why his coming, his presence, would be manifested in the judgments which would be poured out on Israel, on Judea, on Jerusalem, right? So he would come in his Father's glory with his angels. If he's coming in his Father's glory, we can't see him with your natural eye. And then he would repay each one according to what he has done. That's the judgment of good and evil, right? Under the old covenant. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay? So this event where Christ would come in his invisible glory would happen before some of the people who were standing there listening to him passed away. Okay? Tasted death. Good? So John was one of them. Okay? John was one of those. So we see here that the book of Revelation, the revelation of Christ, was to happen in the time of John. He would be revealed as the I am in John's time. And we will look at point number 2 when I come back. So we're going to move on to point number 2. And point number 2 says all of the revelation, the entire vision would completely fulfill in John's time. The entire vision would completely fulfill in John's time. And I know completely and fulfill have the same meanings, but I purposely made that redundant to emphasize the point. It would completely fulfill, and those two words mean the same thing, right? However, we will see how that happens. Revelation chapter 1, verses 3 to 4 and 11, John 14, 21 to 23, Luke 21, 27 to 28, and 31 to 32, Matthew 26, 18, and John 7, verse 2. So we want to go back to our Bible and check out Revelation chapter 1 again and verse 3 and 4. Okay, verse 3 and 4. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and obey what is written in it, because the time is near. All right. John to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. Grace and peace to you from him who is and was and is to come, and from the 7 spirits before his throne. All right. So let's also read verse 11. It says there, saying, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Okay? Those who, let's go back up here to verse 4. Verse 3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and obey what is written in it. Those who would be blessed by what they read, those who would hear the words of that prophecy, and those who would keep the things therein, those to whom those events were at hand, were those who lived at the time of those 7 churches in the province of Asia. Okay? This prophecy, notice, though the blessed is the one who read aloud the words of this prophecy, not these prophecies. This prophecy. This indicate that the entire vision was one prophecy from start to finish. It was not to be divided up, subdivided, and extended, some for the 1st century, some for the 2nd century, some for the 3rd century, some for the 4th century, some for the 15th century, some for the 18th century, some for the 19th century, some for the 21st century. No, it wasn't supposed to be like that. It was one prophecy, and those to whom, the 7 churches to whom it was sent to, were to be blessed by reading the prophecy, by hearing the prophecy, by obeying what was written in it, because the time was near. So the entire thing was near to them from start to finish. From chapter 2 to chapter 22 was near to the churches, the 7 churches in the province of Asia. All right? Consider John chapter 14, for example. John chapter 14, for example. And we read verse 21 to 23. It says there, whoever has my commandments and keep them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and what? Reveal myself to him. So the revealing, according to Christ, the revealing of Christ to his people began in John's time. For it was to his disciples, of whom John was one, that he made this promise to. First made it to them. They were the first recipients of that promise. Now, since Christ made the promise first to his disciples, is no way you're going to tell me that he did not keep that promise, but he's going to keep it to people who lived generations later. He must have kept it for them. I'm not saying he will not keep it for us who live in now. Yes, because Christ manifests himself to us also. in the spirit, right? His presence is there based on events that are happening in our life. We perceive him. But I'm saying it must have been to them first. Okay? So the revealing would have its fullest revelation. That's what the word apocalypsis is what the word revelation mean. Its fullest revealing would happen at his parousia, or the presence, the apocalypsis of his parousia, the revealing of his presence, the revelation of his presence. In him, as we go on to let's continue verse 22 now. Judas, not Iscariot, asked him, Lord, why are you going to reveal yourself to us and not the world? Okay? Now, if I were to put this in for example, let's see the Berean literal Bible. It says there, Judas, not Iscariot, says to him, Lord, then what has occurred that you are about to manifest yourself to us and not the world? Notice, this was a coming or a manifestation that was not going to be a bodily manifestation, because he was going to manifest himself to his people, his disciples, but he was not going to manifest to the world. So it had to be an invisible manifestation. Again, one that requires a sign to be detected, to be perceived, right? Or signs as may, according to the circumstance. So Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him. And we, that is, Christ and his Father, will come to him, individual, personal, and will make a home with him. So this is what the presence of Christ to the disciples was, to bring the Father, the presence of the Father and Christ, to the disciple, to the believer, to be with them, right? But to the enemies of Christ, it was to bring judgment and destruction. Okay? So here we have, similarly as in times past, when the presence or the coming of the Lord came to a nation, it was to bring judgment for the disobedient and the transgressor, and salvation for the believer and the obedient, right? Similarly, Christ's coming was to do the same thing. But that in both cases, it was never a coming where there was a visible form of the Lord. Okay? The coming was manifested, the presence was manifested in the circumstances, okay, of what happened, okay? So both the modern church's narrative is that only a portion of the revelation has happened. Because they have divided up the revelation into 7 church ages. And they say, okay, some of it has happened in the apostles' time. Another portion has happened in the time of the Reformation. Another portion has happened in the 19th century. And the remainder we are waiting to happen in our time. Or maybe in our future. Right? That's how the modern church has it. The modern church, but what John has said, what John had received, is that this was one prophecy. It was not a series of prophecies. Okay? The modern church has treated this one prophecy unit as a series of prophecies so that they can go as a buffet now and just pick off pieces and say, okay, well, this is when Revelation chapter 2 applies here, Revelation chapter 3 applies there, Revelation chapter 4 applies there, and they would pick out events on a timeline of history which has extended over 2,000 years. Right? But this was a single prophecy. according to Revelation chapter 1 verse 3. Okay? So it must be witnessed, all of it, by the people living in John's time. It must have been witnessed, all of it, by those living at the time of the 7 churches of Asia. All right? So, for example, let's look at Luke 21, verse 28. Luke 21, 28 says there, and let's go back to our brain study Bible there. It says, when these things begin to happen, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Okay? So when the events of the Revelation, these plagues and the catastrophes and the calamities were coming upon Judea and Jerusalem, and all the people of Israel were in fear and turmoil, the remnant, Christ said, they should lift up their heads. Why? So that means their heads would have been down. Why were their heads initially down? Because of the persecution. Because of all of the heaviness of the persecution that they were under. Christ said, lift up your heads. Why? Because your redemption, your salvation is drawing near, right? That tribulation which you were experiencing is about to be removed. It is about to be turned upon those who were persecuting you. All right? So at that time, verse 27 is what I should have read first. At that time, they will see the Son of Man. Again, remember, this is the sign of the Son of Man, coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things stand up, okay, so when you see that sign, that sign, the evidence that Christ indeed was the executive judge in heaven, who was orchestrating or executing the judgment on the earth, lift up your head. Right? Because he is going to judge, he was going to judge for them in their favor. Good? Yeah, so that's why their redemption was drawing near. So the time, and let's go down to verse 31. So also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of heaven was near. All right? So remember the kingdom of heaven, where God was taking away the authority from Israel of old and giving it to a new people, which was the kingdom of heaven, the remnant people, or you may say the ecclesia, the church, right? So you know that's where the church would now be established as God's kingdom, and the old kingdom was cast out, right? That time, when you see that, know that time was near, right? Now, if we are of the opinion that this is still future, which means Christ has not yet established his kingdom, which means the church has not been established as the kingdom of heaven on earth, which means the church has no authority to be speaking on behalf of God. Right? If we don't understand that this thing was established 2,000 years ago. Good? Now, verse 32, look what Jesus said. Truly I tell you, this generation, that's the generation of Israel to whom he was speaking to, will not pass away till all these things happen. So the kingdom of heaven was established also in that generation. Right? So notice how it's important for us today that these things have already happened. Because if they have not already happened, it means the church today has absolutely no authority to speak as the kingdom of heaven. To be, what's the word I'm looking for? An illegal entity. right? Because you're saying, oh, well, Christ did not return, but Christ's return was to establish the kingdom of heaven. And if he has not yet returned, then you have no authority. You are an illegal entity. You are still under the system of the old, which is exactly what is happening. Yes, because of your perception, you actually are living without the understanding that you are really supposed to be operating in a different paradigm. But because many and the modern church does not comprehend it or has not grasped this, that is why it is operating in an old paradigm. But the new has been here for 2,000 years now. All right. Revelation 1:3 tells us that the things given in the vision of the revelation were at hand. They were near. Okay, it's the same Greek word. Look what it says. Blessed is the one who reads the words. Blessed are those who hear and obey it. Because what? The time was near to those who were living in the time of John. Those who were living in the time of the 7 churches in the province of Asia. The time for these things to happen, to be fulfilled, to come to pass, to begin, to wrap up. All of that, it was at that time. Now, I once had a conversation with a brother, and I was showing him this word. Well, in the King James, it would say at hand, okay? And he said to me, well, what does at hand mean? And I said, well, it means it was near. He says, at hand could mean anything. You're right? Because, yes, you have to take that position if you think that at hand means 2,000 years have passed and the thing has not yet happened. Then, yes, that would be your interpretation. But what did Christ mean when he said these things were at hand? Well, let's see. Let's look at some examples, right? Because the word here is engus, right? Show it in the lexicon. Engus means near, literally or figuratively, of place or time. So something could be near in terms of proximity. You could reach out and touch it, right? Also, it could be near in terms of time, like it would be here tomorrow or within the next couple of weeks. So it could be near in terms of location, physical location, or it could be near in terms of space of time. Good? So let's look at some examples of how Christ used engus. Matthew 26 verse 18, for example. Matthew 26 verse 18. How did Christ use the word engus? Matthew 26 verse 18, it says there, he answered, go into the city to a certain man and tell him that the teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover with my disciples at your house. When he says my time is near, he meant his crucifixion, his death. Okay? My time is near. Now, what did Jesus mean by that? It means very soon he would have to be crucified. He would have to die for the sins of Israel. Good? So, was that death still to be, are we still expecting Christ to die on the cross 2,000 years later? Or did he die within that generation of Israel to whom he had come to? He died within the same generation. And he died pretty soon after he said that too. Okay? Let's look again. Let's look at another example. John 7 verse 2. Right? John 7 verse 2. John chapter 7 verse 2. However, the Jewish feast of tabernacles was Near, again, the word engus. That means near in terms of time again. Okay? Probably within a couple of days. It was near in terms of time. And it, again, we could say it happened in the generation of the people to whom Christ lived, with whom Christ lived at that time. He wasn't talking about a Feast of Tabernacles that would come thousands of years later after that generation had passed and several other generations had passed. So the word engos always means at least very soon or at most within that person's lifetime. Good? But in either case, they would live to see it. Good? They would live to see it. Now, let me just show you a chart that I have here, right, which demonstrate the understanding of the apostles versus the misunderstanding of the modern generation. All right? The understanding of the apostles versus the misunderstanding of the modern generation. At hand, the apostolic understanding versus the modern understanding. So we have here, let me just blow up this here so that we can see. Okay, so we have here Daniel on the left-hand side. And Daniel received his visions around the year 550 BC, 550 years before Christ. Okay? And in Daniel chapter 10, verse 14, for example, Daniel was told that his vision was to be fulfilled in the latter days, right? The latter days, or the last days, the final days. That will be the final days of Israel, or the final days of their Sinai covenant, right? Which would be the age of Moses. Good? He was told that the vision was for many days. Many days, okay? He was told to shut up the words and to seal the book unto the time of the end. So in other words, the vision was not relevant to Daniel. It was not relevant to Daniel and the people living in Daniel's time. It would happen in the latter days of Israel's existence. It would come to pass many days later. And that is why Daniel was told to shut up the book and to seal it, because it was for the time of the end of the age. And that would be the age of Moses. Now, so approximately 600 years pass, okay? Approximately 600 years pass, and we have John coming on the scene and receiving the vision of the revelation around the year 66. And John was told now that in his vision that the things were to shortly come to pass, as opposed to Daniel, who was told that these things were for many days later. Okay? But 600 years later, John was told that the things were now shortly to come to pass, and that the time was at hand. And therefore, he should not seal up the sayings, for reason being, the time was at hand. So notice, Daniel was told to seal it up because why? The vision was for many days. It was to come to pass in the latter days, or the last days, at the end of the age. John, who was living now in the last days, at the end of the age, was told the things were shortly to come to pass. He was told the time was at hand. He was told, do not seal up the book, because the time was at hand. And in 1 John 2 verse 18, John also said he knew that it was the last hour, or the last time. Now, with all of that said, let's look at the apostolic understanding here now. right? So Daniel receives his vision around 550 BC. He was told to seal it up. And that seal, it would be sealed for many days. Approximately 616 years, 600 years, right? All that time, they were still under the Mosaic age, right? But at the coming towards the end of the Mosaic age, in other words, coming towards the last days of the Mosaic age, you had John coming on the scene, well, Jesus and then John coming on the scene, and John was told now to unseal, right? Because why? These things were now at hand. In fact, they would come to pass in the space of 3.5 years. That is a short time, right? That was indeed a short time. Because why? The end of the age would occur in the year 70, right? The year 70 was when the temple was destroyed. Okay? And remember Matthew 24 verse 3? What would be the sign of, when would these things be? That is, when would the temple be destroyed? What would be the sign of your presence, visible sign of your invisible presence? And what would be the sign of the end of the age? Well, the temple destruction was the sign of the end of the age. Right? So that came to pass a mere 3.5 years after John received the revelation. That's the apostolic understanding. But let's look at the modern church now. The modern church's misunderstanding. Now notice, according to the modern church, yes, Daniel received his vision circa 550 BC, as we said. He was told to seal it up because it would come to pass many days later. That's, yes, approximately 616 years later. And coming to the end of the Mosaic age, we have John and the remnant church coming on the scene to establish the kingdom of heaven. But now we have the vision unsealed, and 2,000 years and counting has passed. Is that still at hand? Is that soon? Is that within the lifetime of John and the 7 churches? We have 2,000 years and counting. And still we have no end of the age in sight. Right? That's the modern misunderstanding. All right? Daniel was 600 plus years before John. Okay? And he was told that his vision would apply, was not relevant to him. It was relevant to those who would be living in the time of the end, those who were living in the last days. Now, John lived in the time of the end. John lived in the last days. John lived in the end of the age. That is the end of the Mosaic age. He was living in the last days of Israel. That was the time of their end. Daniel was told that his vision would come to pass in the latter days, or the last part of the Mosaic age. Right? Daniel was told to seal up the vision because it had no relevance for his generation. John, on the other hand, who was living in the last days, therefore Daniel's vision was relevant in John's time. And in case in case you're not of the opinion that John was living in the last days, let's look at Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1, right? Let's look at Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1. Where are we? Hebrews chapter 1 verse 1 and 2, right? Let's get the Bible. It says, on many past occasions and in many different ways, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets. But in these last days, God has spoken to us. Who's the us there? Israel. God has spoken to Israel by his son in the last days. Okay? So when Christ came and began preaching to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, to whom he said he had been sent, that was the last days of Israel. So John was living in the last days, the same last days which Daniel's visions were to come to pass and be relevant for. And that is why Revelation now was an unsealing of the visions of Daniel. John was told, do not seal it, because the time was now at hand. It was now relevant for his generation living in the last days. Therefore, according to the modern misunderstanding, the last days have been extended for more than 3 times as long as the many days in which they were sealed. You notice that? Let's go back to that chart and look at something. Huh? Look at something here. Let me just give you an overview. Right. Okay. Look at this. You have the Daniel's vision being sealed for 600 plus years. Okay. And then when it came to John's time now, in which it was unsealed and it was at hand, the at hand now extends 2,000 years, which is 3 times as long as the time in which it was sealed. So you want to tell me that when God said this thing was at hand, he meant it was going to stretch 3 times longer than when it was sealed up and not at hand? So according to the modern misunderstanding, the revelation had no relevance to John's generation either. Because you remember, John chapter 1, first Daniel was told, seal up the vision because it's not relevant for you. But John was told, don't seal it because the time was at hand, meaning it's relevant for your generation. But the modern misunderstanding says, no, it wasn't relevant for John's generation either, because it still is not yet fulfilled, according to them. So really, when I began to see what the apostles' understanding was, then I had to put away the modern misunderstanding. I had to bring my understanding in line with the apostolic understanding, because Christ is the chief apostle. Right? Christ is the chief apostle, and he was giving his apostles his understanding. He was communicating, he was sharing how he understood things. And that's why one of the things, when we see who Christ is, whom the revelation reveals Christ as, we would have no problem in understanding and receiving and keeping Christ's understanding, the way that he understood things, because I know who Christ really is. Right? And Christ being whom he really is, then I have to say, well, okay, since Christ is that, and Christ interpreted these prophecies this way, then I need to look at them the same way. So in the context of Jesus's prediction to his disciples, the most reasonable interpretation of at hand would be the event would occur before the last one, at least the last one of them tasted death. Okay? It would be reasonable for me to say that these events would occur before John tasted death. It would be reasonable for me to say that the time for example, the opening of the seventh seal, the scroll in Revelation 5, was near to John's time and would occur before John tasted death. It would be reasonable for me to say that the sealing of the servants of God in Revelation 7 was near and was occurring and would be completed before John tasted death. It would be reasonable for me to say, and for us to say, that the 7 angels sounding their trumpets in Revelation 8 would be completed before John tasted death. It would be reasonable for me to say that the trampling of the holy city in Revelation 11, the trampling of Jerusalem by Rome, would happen before John tasted death. It would be reasonable for me to say that the casting out of the red dragon and his messengers in Revelation chapter 12 would happen before John tasted death. It would be reasonable for us to say that the mark of the beast and the number of the beast in Revelation 13 would come to pass before John had tasted death. The 144,000 of Revelation 14 happened before John tasted death. The 7 last plagues of Revelation 15 happened before John tasted death. The marriage of the Lamb happened before John tasted death. All right? The first and second resurrection, the 1,000 years of Revelation 20, the new heaven and earth, and the new Jerusalem of Revelation 21 coming down, all happened before John tasted death. And most importantly, the coming of Christ in Revelation chapter 22 happened before John tasted death. And we'll look at point number 3 when I come back. So we are going to look at point number 3. And point number 3 says, grace and peace to the 7 churches in tribulation. Grace and peace to the 7 churches in Revelation. And our texts there are Revelation 1, verses 4 and 9. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 to 27, John 16, verses 19 to 22 and 33, John 14, 27, Revelation 2, verses 1 and 7. All right, so let's go to Revelation chapter 1, verse 4 and 9. So let's get our Bible. It says there, verse 4, John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you from him who is and was and is to come, and from the 7 spirits before his throne. In verse 9, it says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance that are in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and my testimony about Jesus. So the 7 churches in the province of Asia, John stated that his book was intended to be sent to the 7 churches which are, meaning they were in existence in his time. Most likely, these churches were those over whom he was the shepherd or the bishop of. Probably he had planted them. And so, following the instruction that God had given, John sent the revelation to these 7 churches, indicating that they were the intended audience of the revelation. Okay? They were the intended beneficiaries of that vision. The modern idea is that the revelation was not for the people in John's time. That's what the modern church thinks. That's what they suppose. But that is not, when you read what the apostle wrote there, you really can't come to that conclusion. But the modern churches supposes that the revelation was not really for John's time. It is really for us in the 21st century, in these supposed last days. Again, when you read in the scripture about the last days, you see the last days really applied to Israel's last days, right? There is nothing in John's writing that indicated also that these 7 churches were supposed to be 7 church ages, stretching from apostolic times into the 21st century and beyond, as we have been told. Okay, that's not, you don't get that from reading John either. Nevertheless, we must take note that the revelation is written in signs and symbols. It's signified. So that the number 7 does have symbolic meaning. Okay? Yes, it was sent to 7 churches. But I do not think that it was restricted to the 7 churches. I believe that revelation was for all the churches in that time, relevant to them. Okay, but sometimes for symbolic purpose and meaning, a number is used. And the number is not necessarily speaking of the quantity, but the quality. Same thing with the number 1,000, right? Like the 1,000 years you read in Revelation 20. That number is not speaking so much, well, it's not speaking at all of the quantity of years. It is speaking of the quality of the years. All right? But let's come back to number 7, right? 7 is the number in scripture that indicates qualitative fullness, completion, finality, the last of a series or of a process. Thus, the number 7 speaks to the fact that the perfection of the church happened in the time of John. Now, this is important for us today. And when I talk about the church, I'm not necessarily talking about these earthly organizations. I'm talking about people who are born of the Spirit, right? People who are living according to the new and living way. I'm talking about those people, right? These people, this information is important for us. Because you see, the teaching today by the modern church is that the church is still being perfected. But when you understand that the revelation is one unit of prophecy, which everything was to come to pass in the time of the 7 churches, you would understand that the church is not still being perfected. It was perfected in John's time. It was perfected as the body of Christ, as the bride of Christ, through the trials and tribulations which happened at its inception. Right? But the church is no longer being formed. It has already been formed. It's a spiritual entity. It's the kingdom of heaven, into which those who are born of the Spirit enter. Good? So, the kingdom of heaven is perfect. It was perfect at its through the trials and tribulations during its birth process, and now it has come into being and has been established. It was made perfect in Christ, and it remains perfect. We who enter now enter into its perfection. We benefit from its perfection. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 5 verse 25, for example. Okay? Ephesians 5 verse 25. You see, because, these are some of the things that keep people in bondage and keep them from having a fulfilling relationship with the Heavenly Father. These sorts of teachings that, the church is being perfected and these kinds of things, and the kingdom of heaven is still afar off, and you're waiting to be resurrected. All of these things which are shown to be things which have been accomplished in the kingdom of heaven already. And we, by being born of the Spirit, enter into these things. They are spiritual realities which we today enter. We're not looking for these things to happen. We actually partake of them when we enter into the kingdom of heaven. Right? And we enter in not when we die, when we taste death. We enter in when we receive Christ, when we believe upon him. Right? So Ephesians 5:25 says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to sanctify her, all right, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a glorious church. Now, when did this happen? Is this still to happen? Well, the modern understanding is this is still to happen. So, at present, the modern church is saying that the church is still, they use the word, there's this word, victorious and militant. Okay, so the church is militant now. It means it's undergoing a process of perfection, being perfected. But that's not what Ephesians 5 is saying. Ephesians 5 is saying Christ presented the church to himself as a glorious church without stain or wrinkle or any such blemish, but holy and blameless. In other words, Christ did not found or establish a stained, dirty, wrinkled church. He established a perfect, blameless, holy, stainless church. That's the kingdom of heaven. He established the kingdom of heaven perfectly holy, perfectly righteous, perfectly blameless, stainless. And that is what you and I enter into. Right? That's the teaching of Christ. And so we come to the apostolic salutation, grace and peace. Because even though the church in the time of John was being perfected, yes, because it was not yet established. Right? It was being perfected because it was not yet established. The bride had not yet come forth. Why? Because the previous woman We just completed a study on the three women of Revelation, right? The woman standing above the moon, the harlot, and the bride. Okay? So we still had the old covenant woman still in place in the time of John. But when she was judged, some, yes, were found obedient, many were found disobedient. And after that judgment and that system moved off the scene, then we had the bride coming forth in her full beauty and glory. Good? And when she came forth, she was perfect. Right? And that happened 2,000 years ago. That is what we enter in today. We not enter into something which is being perfected anymore. The perfection already happened at the inception of the church. So the believers, which the 7 churches, number 7 indicated the culmination, the completion of that perfecting process. They were there was a message of grace that was coming from the throne of heaven. The word grace is charis. Right? Let's go back to Revelation chapter 1 there and look at verse 4. Right? Grace. And the word there is charis. Right? Graciousness. Gracious benevolence. Influential favor. Right? I am understanding here that all of these explanations, what they have here, definitions, what they have here, I have seen that they are not the full explanation. Grace is actually God's super abundant kindness. Right? Grace is actually God's super abundant kindness. You see, the believers at that time who had been raised up under the apostolic ministry as the first fruits of the Spirit. Okay, because remember, first of all, on the day of Pentecost, we had the disciples plus the 120. They first received the Spirit, and they were the first fruits of the Spirit, and they were there at the beginning of the kingdom of heaven being constructed. And then there was the 3,000 again after Peter preached. Again, these were all first fruits of the Spirit, right? They were among the first citizens of this kingdom, right? The apostles were listed as being the foundation, and Jesus was the chief cornerstone, right? They were living stones. Thus, for them, it was a pleasure and an honor to be part of the birth of the kingdom of heaven, right? It was via God's grace that they had that honor, even though many of them gave their lives to have that privilege of being the first stones in that building, so to speak, right? Let's look at John 16 verse 19, right? John 16 verse 19. John 16 verse 19. It says there, aware that they wanted to question him, Jesus said to them, "Are you asking one another why I said, 'In a little while you will not see me, and then after a little while you will see me'?" Verse 20. "Truly, I tell you, you will weep and wail while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman has pain in childbirth because her time has come. But when she brings forth her child, remember the man-child, of Revelation chapter 12, she forgets her anguish because of her joy that a child has been born into the world. So also, you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Right? For them, for those early church folk, the early believers who were going through that trial and that tribulation, which was the birth pangs of the kingdom of heaven, it was a pleasure, just like how a woman goes through those birth pangs, and at the end of them, there is the joy of the birth of her child. Similarly, the believers went through that birth pangs, and they counted it as the superabundant kindness of God, that they had an honor to be part of the birth of the kingdom of heaven. Right? So that was the grace that was being extended to them, that even in the tribulation, they could see it as an honor, of being part of the establishing of this kingdom of heaven. And then peace, grace and peace. This is the apostolic salutation. If you read the writings of Paul, the writings of John, the writings of Peter, they always begin, grace and peace. Okay? Peace in the midst of tribulation. Okay? John chapter 14 verse 27, for example. Right? John chapter 14 verse 27. Says there, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Right? So Christ left his peace with his disciples so that in the midst of tribulation, they can have peace, as he said in John 16:33. Right? John 16:33. He says there, I have told you these things, that in me you may have peace. In me. In me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Right? So understanding what was happening, the revelation, the vision of the revelation, one of the things, it gave them peace, because they saw that all the tribulation they were going through, it was necessary to bring about this kingdom, and that all of that tribulation would be avenged at the coming, at the parousia of the Lord Jesus, when he was revealed as executive judge over Israel, and that he would bring rest from their tribulation. Because notice in Revelation chapter 1, when John gives this apostolic salutation of grace and peace, right? He says in verse I think is 9. Yes, he says, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, right? In the tribulation. So John was also in the tribulation. But grace and peace was being sent from heaven. So that in the tribulation, they may have peace. In the tribulation, they would be receiving of that abundant kindness of God, and they be seeing the kindness of God, so that they understood they would be honored to be there to have that relatively brief period of birth pangs. in the birthing process of the kingdom. But now the kingdom has been born. There is no more tribulation for it. You know, one of the things of these some of these religions, they want you to relive those tribulations. But that was something that happened already. We don't have to go through that process. We just enter into what God has already established, and we rejoice in it, and we live in it, and we walk up and down in it. It is our promised land. So each of the messages to the 7 churches had a reassurance in them that Christ gave. And that reassurance, he would manifest some gift, some aspect of himself to them, that they may overcome the tribulation via that grace that was flowing from the throne. For example, let's look at Revelation chapter 2. Right? Let's look at Revelation chapter 2 for the message to the church at Ephesus. It says, to the angel of the church, or the messenger of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. Right? Now remember, well, I don't know if you know this, but the 7 golden lampstands, according to Revelation 1, if you go back to Revelation 1 and go down to verse 20, it says here, the 7 golden lampstands, right? The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, the perfected church, or the church being perfected, right? That's what the 7 lampstands represented. So, Christ now, in Revelation chapter 2, verse 1, it says, he was speaking now to the church at Ephesus. And he was pointing them to the fact that he was walking among the church. He was present in the midst of the church. Again, this is showing, this is why I believe Christ is the comforter. Right? He was the comforter which was sent to be in the midst of the church. Right? And he's walking there. And the church, that 7 lampstands comes from the lampstand which was in the old covenant sanctuary, which resembled a tree. The 7-branched candlestick was designed to look like a tree. So that made Christ in the midst of the church is the tree of life. Okay? Look at verse 7. Revelation 2 verse 7. Same message to Ephesus now. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says. Now in verse 1, it was Christ who was saying, right? Verse 1, it was Christ who was saying, him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands, right? These are his words. But in verse 7 now, we see it says, it's the Spirit saying again, this is the comforter, right? Christ as the comforter. So Christ was saying to the churches, to the one who overcomes or is overcoming, I will grant the right to eat from the tree of life in the paradise of God. Right? The tree of life is accessed by Christ being in the midst of the church. The tree of life is the paradigm of receiving from God all his gifts, which pertain to eternal, abundant life. Remember, it's a tree, and you can pick the fruits. Right? So it's all those gifts which pertain to eternal, abundant life and godlikeness. And it's a tree that you have to eat from now. Once you are in the kingdom, you have access to the tree. Because the tree is represented by Christ in the midst of the church. So they could eat of Christ, the tree of life, just like they could eat of his flesh and drink of his blood. You remember Christ said that? If you eat of my flesh and you drink of my blood, I will abide in you. Right? So they are eating of the tree of life and they are gaining eternal life. And that eternal life and that eating of the tree of life gives you overcoming, or gave them overcoming power over the tribulations and the afflictions that they were experiencing. Right? It was the grace and the peace that gave them overcoming over their afflictions and tribulations. So they were the sons of God, and they were part of the proclamation of the gospel, which was raising people from the paradigm of death into the paradigm of life. So by eating of the tree of life, they became trees of life. And by preaching the word of life, they raised people out of the paradigm of death into the paradigm of life, which is the true resurrection. The believers at that time had lived the best lives that anyone at that time could have lived. For they were part of the establishing of the kingdom of heaven. They overcame the tribulation by changing their perspective. When they were able to see that they were actually reigning in the kingdom from heaven, they were able to see that the blood of martyrs was actually an offering poured out to God. They were able to see that it was a great honor to partake of Christ's sufferings at the hands of Israel. And once they changed their perspective, they changed their circumstances. And so too, we have to understand, once we change our perspective, once we are born again, once we renew our minds, we change our circumstances. Right? When they changed their perspective from earth to heaven, they overcame the world. And so we have come to the end of this study. I hope you enjoyed it. And we will be back with part 2 next time. So until that time, I'm your friend Murray saying, may God richly bless you.
This has been the New Cosmos Videocast. Remember to comment, like, subscribe, and share.